Like covered basement.
I also mentioned walkout basements that they generally do not have a floor that is below ground level on all sides. So they're not going to meet that definition of a basement. So it looks like we do have our slide up, which is slide 62. Let me just see if I'm able to advance if to. All right, we're getting there.
That's right.
All right.
Woohoo! Yes.
And there we go.
You
So
did it.
back on a particular slide, the reason why it's actually so important to understand that basement definition and how it's defined is because of how coverage is limited in basements in the SFIP. And I do want to point out that many of these very same limitations and restrictions that apply in a basement are also going to apply to those elevated building enclosures in post-firm buildings that are in a special flood hazard area. So when you look at this slide, you're going to see the first set of items listed as those items that are insured in a basement. And they're going to seem quite rudimentary and more about functional items of a building, but all of those items are also insured in a post-firm elevated building enclosure in the special flood hazard areas. And there's some specific, I should say, special flood hazard areas found in the policy form, except for two items. And let me just point those out first, because the two items that are shown all the way down at the bottom of the slide, they not only apply to basements, and it is the unfinished drywall for walls and ceilings, meaning that the policy itself is going to cover the drywall, it's going to cover the cost of laying it, unfinished, unfloated, not taped to the framing. And then that second item is that non-flammable insulation in the basement. So notice
Mm-hmm.
we've indicated basement beside those two because they are not covered in that post-firm elevated building enclosure.
Mm-hmm.
But all of the other items listed here apply to both basements and post-firm elevated building enclosures in the special flood hazard areas shown on the policy. But let me take you through some of these items that are covered. We see the central air conditioners, the furnaces, got hot water heaters, electric junction boxes, circuit breaker boxes, electrical outlets, and notice even elevators and their equipment, such things like dumb waiters and related items. If they're installed below the base flood elevation after September the 30th of 87, and we want you to remember that these limitations are going to apply to all basements in any flood zone, but only to post-firm elevated building enclosures that are located in certain A and B zones in the policy. So when we move further, we can continue taking a look at these items, just keeping in mind again that they should be connected to a power source in order to be insured. And so those are going to be items like pumps and tanks, right? Even some of the solar energy
Mm-hmm.
systems. These items include stairwells, staircases that are attached to a building, sump pumps, water softeners, and some of the chemicals that are inside those water filters and faucets that are all, and these are basically very integral parts of plumbing systems and water tanks, again, footings. So I always like to mention that when it comes to footings, remember that is usually an expensive replacement because that's the foundation of the building. That's why the flood insurance policies so important. And then lastly, we see cleanup, and there's always quite a bit of cleanup that needs to happen as well. Okay, I want to move on to talking about how personal property is covered in a basement. Those items we just listed have to do with building coverage. Now we're talking about personal property. And there's some limitations that still apply in the basement, regardless of the zone that the basement is located in. Also, below that elevated floor of an elevated post firm building in certain A and V zones. Now, notice that this list got a lot shorter than the previous one, right, for
Mm-hmm.
building. Remember that your policyholder number one must purchase personal property coverage for these items to be insured, and then the items must be installed in their functioning location and necessary for operation and connected to a power source. And I love it that term necessary for operation. Now, the only personal property items that can be insured in a basement or certain post firm elevated building enclosures are portable or window air conditioner units, clothes washers and dryers, and food freezers. And and that doesn't mean the walk-in type of food freezer, that same box food
Gotcha.
freezer that we saw earlier. These are the only items. And let's just take a look at this photo because the only items that are going to be covered here would be that very nice washer and dryer. But I'm going to show you another example. This is a very nice basement as well. Now, what items, when you're looking at this, see that would be covered and what items would not be covered? Just take a real quick look at this. Okay, hopefully you came up with the answer. The washer and dryer would be covered. And even though they see that's tucked back in the back, that is right. And some of the items that we do see that would not would be the couch, the pillows, all the other furniture, the carpet, the bathroom items, and the decorations would not be covered. So, this is one reason why this is very important to understand that in those below ground level areas, and we can see we're below ground, can see how high that window is there on the left hand side. All right, you did a really good job on this one. I've just got to wrap up this section with a couple of what we call key takeaways. And number one, NFIP flood insurance can be purchased regardless of the flood zone in participating communities. Also, licensed insurance agents, you have an option of writing your business with the NFIP direct or through a write your own carrier. And we also have those CRS discounts that provide an incentive for communities to keep their flood insurance costs down. And you know what I'd like to do is go ahead and move us right into a poll question since we were just talking about those basements. So here is poll question number 6.
Basement limitations apply in which zone? A, none. B, special flood hazard area only. C, non-special flood hazard only. D, all zones.
Hey, very good. Yes, I see some answers coming in, and the good news is that the majority of you are landing on the correct answer. So we spent a good deal of time talking your low ground level area called the basement, and you are absolutely right. The correct answer is all zones. All zones. Their limitations. Very good. Okay. And so, with that, what I would like to do is move us forward in the session, and we're going to continue to talk about those coverages. As a matter of fact, Carrie's going to step right back in.
Thank you, Melanie. Yes, I'm going to take right over. We're going to talk about those coverage C's, which is other coverage items. With that poll, we've wrapped up all the discussion on coverage A and B. So now let's get into the other coverages. We're going to look at 4 coverage items that include owned and non-owned debris, as well as loss expenses. What's unique about coverage C in the NFIP is that there are coverage C items, but there's no coverage C limit. Coverages A and B limits are not increased as a result of these coverages. So where do the payments for coverage C come from? They come from the insured's available coverage A and coverage B limits, but any payment reduces those limits. We'll begin with the debris removal. Following nearly every flooding event, there's some amount of debris that needs to be removed. The SFIP will only pay to remove debris that the insured doesn't own if it is on or in the insured property. But it'll pay to remove insured property from anywhere. All 3 forms of the SFIP will also reimburse the policyholder's labor should the insured or any members of the insured's household decide to do their own debris removal. The reimbursement rate is based on the federal minimum wage. And again, this coverage does not increase coverage A or coverage B limit of liability. Another coverage C item is the loss avoidance measures. And I'm going to talk about the 2 types of loss avoidance measures on this slide. The first one is for sandbags, supplies, and labor. The policy will pay up to $1,000 for costs the policyholder incurs to protect the insured building from flood or the imminent danger of flood for reasonable expenses to buy things like sandbags, including the sand to fill them, fill for temporary levees, pumps, and other materials like plastic sheeting and lumber. The second loss avoidance measure is property removed to safety. And here again, this policy will pay up to $1,000 for reasonable expenses that the insured incurs to move insured property to a place away from the described location that contains the property in order to protect it from the flood or the imminent danger of flood. Any insured property moved will be insured at the alternate location for a period of 45 consecutive days. Under both loss avoidance measures, the value of work performed by the insured or member of the insured household is considered a reasonable expense. Reimbursement for this work is also based on the federal minimum wage. But there's no deductible that's applied to either loss avoidance measures. These are loss avoidance claims that are not counted towards prior NFIP claims rating factor. It's important to distinguish that these measures must be taken around the time of the flood event. This is not a preventative coverage people can do years in advance. Our third coverage C item is condominium loss assessment. This coverage is only found in the dwelling form. This policy will pay up to coverage A limit, the insured share of loss assessment charged by the condo association as a result of direct physical loss by or from flood. However, this loss assessment coverage doesn't increase the coverage A or coverage B limit. And finally, pollution damage is limited in the general property form. The most the policy will pay is $10,000 for damage caused by pollutants to insured property if the discharge, seepage, migration, release, or escape of the pollutants is caused by or results from flooding. Now we've moved to our next poll question number 7.
An evacuation order has been issued for a tropical storm. Your client purchased $800 in sandbags to help protect their home from flooding. Is this covered under the standard flood insurance policy? Answer A for yes or B for no.
Don't forget to hit that submit button once you've chosen your answer. And it looks like everyone is about done here. All right, and it looks like most everyone chose Yes, this is covered because, again, as we talked about, it will cover up to $1,000 in the loss avoidance measures. So the $800 here in these sandbags would absolutely be covered in this case. Next, we're going to talk about another coverage item, coverage D, which is the increased cost of compliance, or ICC. Coverage D has its own premium, which is calculated by FEMA's system. The ICC premium cannot exceed the maximum of $75 annually. Coverage D is included in all 3 policy forms, and it helps to pay for complying with the state or local floodplain management ordinances. For buildings that do not meet those compliance standards, ICC will pay to elevate, relocate, demolish, or floodproof a building if it has been substantially damaged by flood, or in some communities, if it has been repetitively damaged. Floodproofing activities usually only apply to non-elevated buildings. The coverage limit for ICC is $30,000 under all 3 coverage forms. The limit is in addition to any coverage A limit the insured may have purchased in many cases. But there's something you do need to be aware of here. The total payout on a policy cannot exceed the NFIP's maximum limit available for the building, which includes any payment for the ICC. So let me give you a couple of examples. If the building is a 1 to 4 family dwelling, the total payout cannot exceed the program's maximum amount of $250,000, including any payment for coverage D. $500,000 is the maximum payout for all other residential and non-residential buildings. And one final thing to remember is that coverage D does not have a separate deductible. We're going to talk about more about deductibles in part 2. It's important that you review eligibility for substantial damage and repetitive loss with your clients. Communities participating in the NFIP's regular program have adopted a substantial damage provision in their floodplain ordinance. Substantial damage is defined as being damaged to 50% or more of the building's pre-damaged market value. Some communities may adopt an even lower standard. Some communities might also have a repetitive loss ordinance that could trigger the use of ICC. Repetitive loss is when a building is damaged by flood 2 times in the past 10 years, where the cost of repairing the flood damage is on an average 25% or more of the building's market value. We've now completed reviewing the 4 types of coverage under the SFIP, which again were coverages A, B, C, and D. So it's important we next discuss key exclusions that you need to be aware of. And for that, I will turn it over back to Melanie.
Great, and thank you so much, Carrie. Yeah, we're going to switch to talking about the standard flood insurance policies exclusions. And as always, it's a good idea to read each of the policy forms to get a complete list of those exclusions. Now, the SFIP focuses on direct physical loss by or from flood. So it's not going to provide any type of coverage for time element exposures like the ones that you see listed here. That means it's not going to insure such things as loss of revenue if you're a business, or loss of profit, loss of access or use, business interruption, and it's also not going to provide additional living expenses. Now, here are a few other exclusions, and I'll highlight these because they're the ones that are asked about most often. Now, they are water related, though, but the policy doesn't pay for losses for such things as sewer backup, discharge or overflow from a sump pump or seepage, and also excludes damage from the pressure or the weight of water. It excludes all of these for one simple reason. Each of these by itself does not meet the definition of flood that we looked at earlier in the course. Now, I do caution you because there is an exception here. It's going to exclude all of these unless there is a general condition of flooding in the area and that flood is the cause of those types of losses. So if this type of situation does occur, then yeah, even these types of losses could be insured. Now, let's go ahead and switch from talking about items insured in the SFIP and begin looking at those types of properties that are not insured. We've spent a lot of time on what is insured. So, this particular slide contains a listing of most of the items that are mentioned in the policy form as property not insured. So you should probably review each policy form again to get more complete information. But essentially, the point that this list makes is that most of the SFIP's focus is on insuring buildings. So we don't see any buildings here, right? So let's just go ahead and take a look at this list. We notice that it does not insure land or lawns or trees and plants like that beautiful picture that's on the top left-hand side. And then we've got a few animals, right, that are here as well. Those are not going to be insured. We've got a boathouse on the right-hand side and even some recreational vehicles. But I do want to also mention in this list that this is not all inclusive. And by the way, I've got one more partial list that I'd like to share with you as well on these exclusions. And these are some really nice ones because we got a swimming pool that is shown here. That swimming pool already contains water, so it's kind of likely that it's not going to be covered, as well as that equipment that services it. Retaining walls. We get a lot of requests for walkways and deckways, driveways and patios and the like, even seawalls. Once again, they are there for protection. Even piers and docks are for recreation, but they are not covered on the NFIP policy. You've got your aircraft and your watercraft that we see here. Once again, not covered. Now, here's an interesting fact. If you look at that bottom bullet there, notice that the hot tubs and the spas that are not bathroom fixtures are not going to be covered. So, you got your hot tub out on the deck. It's not a bathroom fixture, so it is not going to be insured. And with that, we've got one more poll question we'd like for you to come in on, and this is poll question number 8. Aaron?
After a flood, your client could not open their shop for 2 weeks. Does their flood insurance policy cover their loss of business income? Answer A for yes or B for no.
Right, and thank you, Aaron. And now just remember that we did go over this, right? This is one of those time element exposures. So what did we say about that? Okay, I'm happy to announce that the majority of you did select the correct answer, which is absolutely no. This would not be, because this is like revenue. Okay, try that again. There we go. Yes, it is not going to be covered because, again, it's like business income. So it's got losses and profits, and it's not direct physical loss by or from flood. So it would be excluded on the NFIP policy. All right, great job on that. And let's move into talking about how losses are actually settled with the NFIP. And it's done in 3 ways. You have your building replacement costs, which is determined at the time of loss. Then you have your actual cash value or your special loss settlement. We're going to talk about each one of those one at a time, starting with the dwelling form. And again, these 3 methods, we'll talk about replacement costs here as it relates to the dwelling. Now, there are some eligibility requirements for replacement cost value, and it only applies to those single family dwellings. I'll say that again, single family dwellings, and it only applies to building coverage. Why? Because contents is always going to be paid out at
Cash
ACV or
value.
actual cash value. And by the way, it must be a principal residence. Okay, that's a little different from primary that we mentioned earlier. What this means is that the insured or the insured spouse must have lived there for at least 80% of the 365 days immediately before that loss. And not only that, the building has to be insured to value, and that is considered to be 80% of the replacement cost at the time of loss, or it could also be the maximum available under the NFIP. And just, as a reminder, when we're talking contents, that's always going to be ACV. So we've got a single family dwelling that may be eligible for replacement costs. But there's one more situation, and that is the Residential Condominium Building Association policy. And I'll highlight this addition settlement where replacement cost applies. The RCBAP is a form we looked at earlier, and it's designed to write residential condominium buildings that are owned by the condo association on behalf of all of its unit owners. I mentioned there's a shared interest there. And this replacement cost loss settlement applies to that condominium building when they're insured this policy form. Now, just like the dwelling form, the replacement cost loss settlement using the RCBAP is going to require sort of the same thing. It's got to be insured to value. And what does that mean? Well, it's got to be insured to at least 80% of that building's replacement cost at the time of loss, or it could also be up to the maximum limit available, and that is to absolutely avoid a co-insurance penalty. What is that? I haven't mentioned that yet. Well, let's take a look at that co-insurance penalty. Now, you might have a general knowledge of co-insurance clauses and penalties, but this is the actual formula for how the RCBAP policy works. So on the left, you see you've got the amount of insurance that the insured has at the loss, and it's going to be divided by the amount of insurance that is actually required. We're going to take a look at some examples too. So you multiply that by the amount of loss, and you see that there's a limit of recovery. So if, in fact, the full replacement cost of the building at the loss we mentioned, or the maximum amount of insurance, is not available for that building under the NFIP, then it's going to revert to whichever is less. Now, obviously, if you've got a condominium association that underinsures a bill, any loss settlement can be significantly compromised when you have to apply this formula. So just remember, number one, the RCBAP is the only one of the forms that has this co-insurance penalty. And of those three, this is the only one that this particular formula would apply. Now, let's move on to look at actual cash value. We talked a little bit about it, and it basically is the cost to replace an insured item of property at the time of loss minus the value of its physical depreciation. Now, here's an example really quickly. You purchased a couch for $5,000. You purchased it a decade ago, but it flooded today. So you would not be paid $5,000 like that couch was brand new, right? Because it's no longer new. Its value is going to be based on today's cost, and then it will be depreciated. So if a does not meet the replacement cost criteria, it's almost the same. We discussed actual cash value loss settlement is going to apply for those that are not eligible for RCV, but it also applies to some mobile homes and travel trailers that we're going to talk about next. But before we do that, let's just take a look of the items on this slide, because their losses are settled on ACV basis regardless of what policy form is being used. So we should note that those 2 to 4 family buildings, that's the duplex, triplex, and quad that I mentioned earlier, well, those are going to be settled at actual cash value. And then you've got your single family dwellings that aren't eligible for replaced value, like you've got a non principal residence, for example. Well, even if it's the principal residence, but it's not properly insured to value, then it's going to have ACV applied. And it basically applies to all other residential buildings and all other non residential buildings, including that detached garage. And we've already mentioned personal property and certain mobile homes. Now, there's one last loss settlement, and I'll mention that is special loss settlement. It's special because it only applies to certain mobile homes and travel trailers that meet the following conditions. These mobile homes or travel trailers, they got to be at least 16 feet wide and have at least 600 square feet. And that's it. They also, however, have to be the principal residence in order to qualify for the special loss settlement. Now, if there happens to be a partial loss of one of these mobile manufactured homes, according to the replacement cost loss settlement, if replacement cost criteria, as we said, is not met, then it's going to be a partial loss settlement at ACV. And if there's a total loss, which is our last bullet here, then coverage is the least of three numbers. One, the building's limit of liability. Two, the replacement cost of the dwelling, or 1.5 times the ACV. And again, we're going to move to whichever one of those is lesser. Now, all mobile homes, travel trailers that we've looked at on the last slide, they have their losses settled at ACV. And by the way, this brings us to our very next poll question, number 9. Erin?
Assuming each building is insured to value under the standard flood insurance policy, replacement cost loss settlement applies to which of the following? A summer home in coastal Texas. B, a 44-story apartment building in Chicago. C, a high-rise residential condo building in Miami. D, an office building in Los Angeles. Or E, a single-family principal residence.
Okay, great. And thank you so much, Erin. Now, I'm going to give you a hint. We talked about all of these. What we're looking for is that replacement cost loss settlement. And I did go over which of these types of buildings would be eligible for replacement costs. I did go over that. And the good news is the majority of you have located the correct answer. But I've got quite a few of you that are looking at that summer home in coastal Texas. Well, that summer home is just that. It's a summer home, which means it is not going to be eligible. It doesn't meet the principal residence. Remember that, where you have to reside there 80% of the time prior to the 365 days. That's right. So our correct answers are that high-rise condominium building in Miami. Remember, it was the residential condominium buildings and also a single-family principal residence, which is the dwelling, single-family dwelling. All right. Well, I have to give you some good accolades on that particular question because it wasn't necessarily an easy one. And I will add that the apartment building is going to be at ACV as well as the office building. Okay, with that, Carrie's going to come in and tell us more about policy administration.
Thanks again, Melanie. Now that we've reviewed how the SFIP losses are settled, we're going to begin looking at the NFIP policy administration, like Melanie said. More specifically, the general rules for issuing and governing the NFIP policies. Let's start with effective dates. Bear with us one moment. For effective dates, the standard 30-day waiting period affects new flood insurance policies and endorsements, adding or increasing coverages. But there are 3 exceptions to that 30-day wait. The exception used most involves loan transactions. If flood insurance is initially purchased in connecting with the making, increasing, extending, or renewing of a loan, then it will be effective at the time of the loan closing period that the policy is applied for at or before the closing. The second exception is related to map revision, where the map is revised to show the building to be an SFHA when it was previously in a non-special flood hazard area. The third exception is the post-wildfire exception, which has special requirements. Please see the Flood Insurance Manual Section 2 before you start for more information on that. On the policy effective, once the policy is effective, the full NFIP policy term is 1 year for an annual term, and all policies expire at 12:01 a.m. on the last day of that 1-year policy term. We have one more topic to hit in this section that can sometimes come up if a policy premium is underpaid, and that's policy reformation. In the NFIP, a policy can only give the amount of coverage that the premium received will purchase for a full policy term, or for an applicable portion of that policy term. So if an NFIP policy carrier has to reform a policy if it discovers at any time, whether it's at the time of new business, an endorsement, or renewal, or even before or after a loss, that the premium received isn't enough to buy the amount of coverage or contents requested. A policy would also have to be reformed if the rating information is not sufficient, and when it's complete, it'll result in an underpayment. The carrier will then bill the additional premium that's required to restore the originally requested amount of coverage. To restore the coverage amount without a waiting period, the carrier must receive the additional rating information, if it's necessary, within 60 days of being requested. And then the carrier must receive the additional premium within 30 days of the date the bill is sent. The other types of reformation, such as non-premium or premium-bearing changes, can be applied to the policy. These changes include like a lender, mortgage change, or assigning the policy or rating adjustment. And with that, let's move on to policy renewals. NFIP renewals occur annually, and the renewal premium may change due to updated rating information, premium rate updates, or even changes in discounts. In the NFIP, premiums cannot increase more than the annual premium increase cap. Payments must be made on time, and in fact, premium payment is considered late 30 days or more after the expiration date of the policy. If this occurs, it causes a lapse in coverage. Please note that within the policy, this reference to days is calendar days and not business days. Therefore, at each opportunity, be sure to remind your policyholders to pay their premiums on time. Now that we've stressed that importance of paying on time, let's look at the lapse in coverage rule. All policies have a 30-day grace period to pay their premium. That means if the payment is not received within 30 days following the expiration, the policy is considered a lapse, regardless of who the payer might be. If a lapse occurs on or after 30 days following the expiration, a new policy with payment is required. Such a lapse may affect policy rating, including the loss of the annual premium increase cap discount and other statutory discounts like newly mapped and pre-firm discounts that we talked about earlier. So these discounts can be lost and have a significant impact on a policyholder's premium. We're going to wind this segment down now by switching from policy reformation and lapse in coverage to policy cancellations. The NFIP limits the reasons for canceling or nullifying a policy to a select number of reasons. This slide outlines the valid cancellation reason codes as they're listed in the NFIP manual. Cancellation or nullification reasons are grouped under the following broad reasons: no insurable interest, establish a common expiration date, duplicate coverage, not eligible for coverage, lender no longer requires insurance, invalid payment, or fraud. There are other reason codes, such as nullification prior to policy effective date, the SRL being rewritten in an incorrect insurer, continuous lake flooding, or closed basin lakes, or cancel and rewrite due to administrative error. But be sure to refer back to the NFIP Flood Manual for specific guidance on each reason code and related situations. Let's talk a moment to discuss some of the key rules and reminders. Notice at the box on the far left, all NFIP policies, whether written through a write your own carrier or through NFIP Direct, have a 1-year policy term. In fact, all policies expire at 12:01 a.m. on the last day of the 1-year policy term. The new contractual agreement begins when the expiring policy renews. Now for the middle box, as an agent, you may be asked to provide evidence of insurance, particularly for a loan closing. There are 2 primary ways to supply this evidence. At the time of application completion, you may provide the lender with a copy of the application along with the proof of payment. Once the policy is processed, a declaration page will be mailed to all interested parties noted on the policy, including the lender. The simplest and cleanest way to provide a copy of the policy deck page. But if it's not available for some reason, the second option is to use a copy of the completed application along with that proof of payment. And one more thing, look at the final bullet in that box. It says no binders because the NFIP does not issue or recognize binders. And finally, let's look at the box on the far right. We have one more area to discuss, community participation. Although most participating communities remain in good standing in the program, there are times when a community may be placed on probation or even suspended by FEMA, which we briefly mentioned earlier. Either of those could happen if a community doesn't comply with the NFIP floodplain management provisions it agreed to. So how would that work? Typically, FEMA first places a community on probation, which is usually for about a year. During that time, policyholders would receive a $50 surcharge on all new and renewed policies. And that's done to call attention to the community's probation status. Because if the community doesn't correct its compliance issues, it can be suspended. When a community is suspended, it essentially becomes non-participating community. No NFIP flood policies can be sold or renewed in a suspended community. Policies already in force will remain effective until they expire. But as I said, they won't be renewed. And here we have moved on to our last and final poll question, number 10.
To avoid a lapse in coverage and loss of statutory discounts, which of the following are true? A, renewal payment can be received within 15 days of the expiration date. B, a renewal payment must be received within 29 days of the expiration date. Or C, a renewal payment can be received 30 or more days after the expiration date. Select all that.
Just be sure to submit those answers. And this again is what we previously talked about. So we avoid lapse in policy coverage. Looks like most people are winding down. All right, and the answers here are, we have A and B, because again, to avoid the lapse in coverage, the payment must be received within 30 days of the expiration date. So the first one being 15 days and then 29 days are both acceptable. It's anything that's 30 days and more that will give you that lapse in coverage. Great job there. So let's move to our last key takeaways. Closing out our part 1. We had the coinsurance penalty only applies to RC BAP building coverage limits. The SFIP features 3 approaches to loss settlement, depending on the forms used, the actual cash value, replacement cost, and special loss settlements. And then the cancellations are allowed for a select number of reason codes. Even though we are at the end of our slide here, please be sure to stay tuned so Erin can walk you through the information regarding your continuing education, certifications, and completions. On behalf of Melanie and myself, I want to thank you for joining us today for part 1 of Key Fundamentals for Flood Insurance. Erin, please take it over. Erin, are you able